Thank you. I'm ready. Thank you.
All right. So you were relatively recently diagnosed. And I actually, those are some of my favorite guests because I just feel like when you're in the middle of just that profound sense of self-discovery, I just find it so amazing. And I always feel like it's such an incredible time. I like to relive it. As you know, I've only been
Mhm.
diagnosed like a year and a half, so I'm talking like I've been diagnosed for decades, but sometimes it feels that way when you have ADHD. I like to say,
Yes.
right, a year in ADHD
Mm.
terms is like a decade. So why don't you walk me through it, kind of what was going on in your life, because you were not only diagnosed with ADHD, but also ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So why don't you kind of walk me through
Yeah.
what was happening that kind of led you up to thinking I should really look into this?
Yeah. So I've been in and out of like mental health care since I was 18. So my first diagnosis was bipolar 2, which is like the mini bipolar, is how I always describe it to
Mm-hmm.
people. And then, of course, depression, anxiety, manic depression, like a couple different things followed on and off through that time. Um, Antidepressants never really worked. Mood stabilizers, meh. I went like 10 years without any medication and just using more holistic treatments, which when I met my most recent therapist, that was like a thing for her. She's like, wait a minute, you're obvious, typically people with that condition really need support. So she actually, and even before that, let me go back a little bit here. 2020 happened. So like intuitively, like this whole time I kind of knew, right? Something isn't adding up. But then 2020 happened. And then right at the beginning of COVID, I had an asthma exacerbation. And if you sneezed or coughed, you couldn't do anything as a nurse at that time. They just would not let you go to work. So I was home for 3 months and I was on TikTok. And of course I ended up on mental health TikTok. And I started seeing all these ADHD and autism spectrum and women with these presentations that even as a nurse I didn't know were really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Especially as a nurse that works with people on the autism spectrum with other comorbidities, I always had this mindset, right? Very limited view. So, I had to sit with it for a while, not wanting to like armchair diagnose myself, not wanting to over identify, and not wanting to try to enter a space where I have no right being. That was my biggest concern. And even where I'm having like some hesitation today is I'm like, oh, golly, that's right. Like, here I am talking, functioning, like, and I'm the best. So it came to me through the pandemic, through TikTok, but then I went to actual diagnostic testing. And then when I met my therapist, even without me really prompting her, she said, we should really like do a whole reevaluation of where you're at. So she did, and she went through the ADHD questionnaire, the ASD questionnaire, depression, and like the whole gamut, like three sessions, 3 1-hour sessions. We went just through diagnostic criteria for the first time since I was 18 and I'm 35. So yeah, I've only been diagnosed like 4 or 5 months. And it really,
Wow.
yeah.
Sounds like you hit the jackpot with your therapist.
I was looking at, because I live in Hawaii and the resources are limited to say the least. And I kept looking, I didn't see anyone, I said, you know what, this is my last ditch effort. I'm gonna try one more time. I'm gonna look. And she was there. And she told me that she was always listed, but I didn't see her. So it was just meant to be. And I really did hit the jackpot because my other idea was to go through GRASP organization on the mainland and get diagnosed. But that would have been probably close to $1,000 to get the dual diagnosis. So I
Mm.
really did get, and that's with funding and subsidies. Like that's the cost effective one out of pocket, sadly. So, I was very, very happy to find a good therapist.
Yeah, right. I know. I have often said on this podcast, like my experience was so positive in terms of my diagnosis, and I feel so grateful because I have heard so many stories of women just time and time again going back. And, granted, I did have a long history like you of kind of this diagnosis of depression and anxiety and never really feeling like the antidepressants were working. And, a lot of that similarity and sort of feeling like nobody ever said to me, like, wait a minute, they should be working. the
Yeah,
antidepressant should be working, like maybe instead I was met with a lot of that, like, well, let's up the dose, let's add in
right,
something else, right?
right.
And you just kind of think you kind of get trapped in that cycle. So
Yeah, and it's easy
to
to do that.
yeah, right. So to have somebody kind of see the big picture that way with you, I think is so important when you're in that journey. So now what happened? So you're working as a nurse, but you were on
Mhm.
leave and you're kind of going through this diagnostic process. What happened? What were some of the like revelations looking back over the course of your life, being like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, the signs were always there.
Yeah. So one of the main things I remembered was as a kid, just homework being this horrible, horrible experience. And my parents are amazing and they did everything they could, right? But they didn't really know what to do with me. Yelling
Yeah.
at me was too much. I cried because the rejection sensitivity, right? So it's like they couldn't discipline me really. So my stepmom, I remember one day, she was just probably at her wits' end, I don't know. And she just said, here's a roll of toilet paper because I was crying. She's like, you're either going to finish your homework first or finish this roll of toilet paper first. Because, she's tried every other way.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so that lines up the rejection sensitivity, the excelling in reading Shakespeare in like high school and the hyper focusing with the autism spectrum disorder, like knowing every sonnet, and with ADHD, having that ability to know so much about a topic, but at the same time struggle to maintain the B's, which were good grades, but like I had to work really hard in math to get that B or C to keep myself out of trouble in grade school. So yeah, so it was that, and just the inability to hold social interactions with people was another big thing that I noticed, or being overstimulated. And looking back, with that 2020 vision, is a lot of times I thought it was anxiety. It was actually overwhelm.
Right.
It
Yeah.
was just overwhelm. And that, I think, was the most mind-boggling moment for me. I'm like trying to count to 10, I'm trying to deep breathe, I'm doing all, which do help, and I'm not knocking those things at all. But now I know that sometimes I just need to remove whatever it is that's
Mhm.
causing the overwhelm.
Yeah. For me, a lot of my depression diagnosis came through like inexplicable anger and sadness, right? So I always sort of thought like I would have these outbursts of rage
Mm,
and anger and frustration, especially when I became a mom. And never making that connection that this was due to sensory overwhelm, right? Or just overwhelm, and
right.
that I think was like so it, like now in hindsight it seems so obvious that I'm like, why did I not connect those dots, right? But like it was really interesting to look back over my life and to think the reason why I felt like a depressed person was because I felt so inadequate all the time, right? And so that
Right.
inadequacy comes from feeling, from being angry and feeling like I was disappointing other people, never really feeling authentically depressed, but always sort of feeling like a lot of my depression came from the fact that I felt like I was disappointing other people and that I wasn't the kind of person I should be, quote unquote. And like, so
Mhm.
that, and a lot of that came from just the anger and frustration and the inability to like connect with people. And so, yeah, it was really interesting because so much of that emotional regulation, like you said, comes back to
Yes.
overwhelm and sensory issues. And I was like, wow, like, if I had just had like a Bacta tank in in my childhood and teen years, like or in my new motherhood years, if I
Yeah.
had just had that sensory deprivation tank, it would have been,
Oh
for those of
yeah.
you who aren't Star Wars fans, if I had made that connection, oh my goodness, how different I think my life would have been. And it's really like relatively simple in terms of that, it just seems so obvious, I guess, in hindsight. Hindsight is 2020, like they say.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that I could really relate to you saying like a lot of the depression was, not feeling like enough, or that inadequacy,
Mhm.
and that still like comes up. It's like, oh, like I did, with the ADHD, I'm like, I did like 5,000 things today. but I still have 10,000 left to do. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And it's that time blindness is just like crazy. Like, feeling like I've been doing stuff for like how many hours? Like feels like 14 hours some days. And I look, I'm like, oh, it's like been working for like 4 hours. Okay, well
Right.
then.
Yeah. Yeah, and the intense expectations that we have on ourselves for so many reasons, being bright and being capable and I think, leads to that sense of like always feeling like you should be able to do more. And then yeah, and so that would lead me to kind of getting overwhelmed and getting really angry. And I remember like, I going back to like having babies because it was such a pivotal time in my life, but like getting really frustrated about things and my husband kind of stopping me and being like, are you okay? And those are those moments, right, when you like have it mirrored back to you where somebody's like, you're not being normal right now. And then I would sort of stop and be like, oh God, you're right. I am. And then that spiral would start with like, oh, I'm a terrible person. What is wrong with me?
Right,
I need to get help for the sake of everyone else. Right. Like
right.
it's so hard to articulate how complicated those thought processes are for us.
Yes,
Unless we're
yes,
talking to each other. And that's why I love these
yeah.
conversations, right? Because you're like, oh
I
my God,
know.
yes.
Yeah,
Uh,
I know. Like, yeah, like listening to your podcast because I listen a lot. I Part of what I do with my ADHD now is instead of giving myself a reward for doing something afterwards, I do it while I'm doing the thing. So I've been trying to ride an elliptical at home for like 8 minutes at a time. I just started. I listen to podcasts,
mhm.
and yours is one of the main ones I listen to actually. But yeah, it's to hear the other women speak about these different things. And I just listened to the podcast where you guys were talking about sex, and I was like, oh, okay, like, yeah, like she has like this, like the mindset. And I felt like that explained ADHD to me on all levels in my life. It's like I have to have a good mindset or that task can just fall apart.
Oh,
Like,
right. Yeah.
they're like, yeah, you have to have, I'm trying to use I statements. I have to have a good mindset, or like the exercise won't happen or the charting won't happen, like,
Mhm.
and the sensory overwhelm I have at work sometimes between smells, sounds, having to mask a lot and have a really like not having a resting bitch face but having this really empathetic face on for a couple hours at a time. It's just like when I get home I'm just like, oh, I'm like, okay. And then it's just that ADHD. I think I don't know if it's ADHD, if you've ever experienced, or you any of your guests have like that shutdown that kind of happens after the overwhelm,
Oh
or if
yeah,
that's more.
especially when you come home to your safe space, right? Like just that exhalation. And yeah, absolutely, like needing that sensory deprivation to recover. And I think that's another thing too. I kind of always chronically underestimated how much recovery time I need from certain sensory overwhelm moments in my life. And that's been something I've really, since my diagnosis, I've tried to put in a lot
Mm,
more downtime than I ever thought I needed,
mhm,
like more rest, more quiet. It always comes back for me. That's been huge because I always want to go and I always want to do more. And I always feel like there's got to be more time to do this stuff. And I really had to like force feed myself downtime.
mm. Yeah,
So
yeah,
now, how did you end up in nursing? So my big two questions are: how did you end up in
yeah.
nursing, and how did you end up in Hawaii? Because asking for a friend, because I'm in
Yeah,
like
no
the
worries.
throes of winter in the Northeast, and you're from the
Oh,
Northeast, right? So
yes,
yeah,
yes, Jersey originally, yes.
so you get it. So I'm like,
I
how did
do.
you end up here?
So I ended up in nursing. So my memory of it doesn't match my family's memory, which is the funniest part. And I think that's
It's
ADHD and
common, yeah,
ASD.
right?
Like, yeah. So I'm gonna tell my version because that's who's here today. My version is I was at community college and I saw nursing students in white in their white scrubs. And I had no idea that these were nursing students. So like I just walked up to them and I was like, why are you wearing all white? No hello, no, how are you? No, my name is. Why are you wearing all white? And they're like, we're nursing students. And then I was like, oh, and I had no idea what I was going to do. So I was like, that makes sense. I've always taken care of people. I've always been like that little nurturing person my whole life, taking care of others. So I went and got my associate's degree in nursing, and that was a little over 10. I've been nursing 10 years now. Um, and the funny thing is, I think I was reflecting on this yesterday, and I think that if I knew I was neurodiverse, I might not have chosen nursing. And I love it. I love nursing, but I'm also tired.
Yeah.
So it's like, um, and nursing is really how I got to Hawaii. I graduated nursing school and I never moved away from home, but I wanted to move to Australia because impulse.
Why not?
So my my dad was like, that's a little far. That's a little far. And my boyfriend at the time had a family member on Oahu. So we ended up going to Oahu. And then we moved to California where I met my husband. And when we were still dating, I said, I'm going back to Hawaii. I'm not necessarily, it's always just been home and the culture, the native culture is the indigenous culture is just beautiful and the people are beautiful and it's hard to live here. But it's for us, it's worth it. So I moved back to Maui about I think 3 or 4, coming up on 4 years now. Um, and I'm never leaving. I love it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I ended up here through a lot of traveling and through the blessing of nursing and being able to work in different states and have a job.
Oh, I'm very jealous, especially at this time of year. Uh, I've been a few
Yes.
times and it's just extraordinarily beautiful. I absolutely, oh my goodness. There's a peacefulness that you can't get anywhere else.
No, and there's pretty much one or two ways to everything, which with my ADHD really helps with overwhelm. I just know like there's two ways to get to most places I need to go. And once I learn it, then driving becomes a lot easier. And so it's like island life is very well suited, I think, for my neurodiversity. Um,
Yeah, that's really interesting. Has there been any
yeah.
other kind of revelations like that?
I mean, like our biggest, you can see our 1 6-story building from like miles away because everything's pretty small here. Like when the airplanes land in the middle of the old abandoned cane field, kind of like it looks, well, it's an airport, but surrounded by cane field. But the airplanes look huge because there's nothing big. So for
Mhm.
me, there's not a lot of sensory overwhelm here. So the lack of sensory overwhelm, the peacefulness at night, the friendliness of people, and the slower pace. So like if I need to take a minute to answer a question, it's not like the East Coast where like if you pause for like 3 seconds, they're like, come on, did you want the bagel or not? Or whatever the case would
Mhm.
be. Here they're like, we just wait. Like we might get a solid 10 seconds to make a decision. Or
Mhm.
even, and it's a relief. Because decision making is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. I never thought about that. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about like really needing to be in nature, and I really do
Yes.
like I loved living in a city. I grew up in a city and I loved living in New York City for
Mm.
in my early 30s. But I've been like kind of in a rural area for 10 years now. And I'm like, I hate going back to the city now. It's just like sensory
Mhm.
death. It's so much, too much. Um, and I just sort of attributed it to like getting old and getting used to the country. But it's so fascinating
Mhm.
to think about what works for our brains and what doesn't. So that was interesting about the driving.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. The
and
nature too, you're right. You're right about the
right.
nature. That's huge. Like especially here, you can do mountains, you can do beach the same day. Like it, if I need to hug a tree, there's so many trees. If I need to go in the water, I can go in the water. Like there's ways to ground everywhere.
Yeah, I know. And I'm fascinated by what it is about nature. I feel like I have lots of theories about like, um, you know, I'm not really a spiritual person, but I sort of feel like there's a connection to nature that you don't get with other people. And I think maybe because so many of us have had like problematic it's probably communication
Mm.
is problematic when it comes to other people in our life for the most part, and there's
Yes.
something like very simple. And I was talking to my 10-year-old son the other day. He's such a deep soul, and he was talking about like he's at that age where he's become very existential, and he was talking about how it's troubling to him that he is not the same with everybody, that it's like, I'm one way with
Mm,
my teacher, and I'm one way with my friends, and I'm a different way with you, and like
wow.
nobody sees the whole me but me.
Wow.
And I could tell he was like, felt very isolated, right? Like he could
Yeah.
see that that was like sort of fundamentally lonely. And I was,
Yeah.
part of me was like, yeah, it is kind of fundamentally lonely when you realize that. um but then we started having a conversation about masking, and what masking
Hmm.
even is, and it was really
Yeah.
fascinating to me. I don't know what nature, I think it was just that idea of like, there's something for me, I feel like my whole self when I'm in nature in a way
Hmm.
that's just very peaceful, like you feel sort of, I feel like I am my true self
Right.
when I'm in nature in that way. But anyway, I want to hear
That's
more. I
cool.
want to talk more about nursing
Sure.
because I feel like it
Yeah.
is such, like, like you said, I feel like a lot of neurodivergent adults end up in caretaking roles, right? So like you said, like
Yes.
nursing, teaching, it's social services, like there,
Right.
and it makes sense because like it makes sense that we have an abundance of empathy. It makes sense that we are bleeding hearts. But then there's
Hmm.
also the like spinning plates theory, right? Like, you can be really at your best in high stress situations, but at the
Right.
same time, like you're chronically exhausted, and so then there's
Right.
that burnout issue.
Yes.
So what has been your experience, or you actually, I think when you wrote to me, you said that you felt like your ADHD makes you a successful nurse. So I wanted you to kind of elaborate on like
Yeah.
what it is about your neurodivergency that has made you open up just sort of that choice of profession, and what have been some of your insights into burnout, especially because that's
Yeah.
where, and then we'll talk about your specialty.
Okay.
uh,
So for nerd, I think that a lot of us are drawn, and since I've like come out of the neurodivergency closet, I've said I had ADHD to two nurses, and they're like, "Oh, me too." So, like, and it's interesting because though I think that okay, so I'm gonna try not to ramble. So the first question,
Well, I
okay,
gave you
so
like
I
a
think
3-part question too,
you
so you
did.
have to kind of backtrack a bit.
So the first part is kind of what draws to nursing. So for me, it is that caregiving. Like I love helping. I love to help. Like not only, and it also gives my brain something really concrete but yet creative to focus on. Like for example, like wound care. Like I call it the arts and crafts of nursing. So there's a science to it and there's a method to it, but also how I put the bandage on might be different than how another nurse puts it on. But you'll get the same result because it's the same bandage. So it allows my brain to hold on to facts to help me with the overwhelm that I experienced with nursing that now makes so much sense. Like never made sense. Like why, and in transparency, I've never been a hospital nurse. I tried it for 6 months. It was too much. I've always been home health, administration, patient care, like, one on one. Like that's where I thrive
Mhm.
as a nurse or survive some days. So that's what I love about nursing. And I burned out in nursing hard, like a dying star collapsing in on itself, like about 6 years ago now at this point. And I didn't know I was neurodivergent at the time. So I thought it was just that professional nursing burnout. I didn't realize it was autistic burnout. I didn't realize it was ADHD burnout. I just thought it was just from work. Um, and I think a lot of neurodiverse folks do burn out because we do have that spinning plates. We do thrive in high intensity environments, but you're going to drop all the plates when you get home, and you're also not going to drop your patients. You're going to drop yourself before you drop your patients because, especially in the home health arena, it's I am the nurse that's in the home with them. If they're having a hard day, I am the one person that's going to see them that day that then needs to advocate to the doctor, the therapist, my fellow staff members, like everything. So who are all very supportive, thank goodness. But at the same time, it just leads to burnout, and our reserves are naturally lower as neurodiverse people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like I think that our cups, we can fill our cups, but maybe our cups aren't as big. Like I might be working with like an 8-ounce mug, versus another nurse that might be able to work with like a liter bottle. Like, our both our cups are full, but I need to fill mine more frequently, or in smaller doses. I can't just do like that weekend spa thing and just dump a bunch of water in, like I have to put a little bit in each day.
I like that metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So that was that. And then I don't know if what other parts to your question? I
So
apologize.
I think it was mostly, what is it? Why do you think neurodivergent minds are so attracted to caregiving? And then kind of
Mm,
what it was you had, what it was about your neurodivergency that makes you
ah,
successful.
yeah.
And then the third part was talking about burnout and like who takes care of the caretakers.
Okay. So let me thank you for that. That's so helpful. So let me go back to how my neurodivergence helps me in nursing. Because I don't think I really touched on that enough. Because if there's any other nurses that listen to this, or any nurturers, anyone that cares for another being, whether it's a parental role or a job role, um, it's our empathy, it's our ability to think about the other person. Because especially if we know we're neurodiverse, or know that we have challenges in any way in ourselves, we quite often have not received that grace of someone saying, well, they're thinking about this differently. Let me try to see if I can think like they are. Um, so because we haven't had that grace in our life in the amount that we would have liked to have it, we're ready and willing and able, to give it to someone else. We're able to think outside the box, especially with the ADHD, like to just be like, all right, well, this is, especially nursing, like this is the shit show I was handed today. How can I, how can I make this better? Um, and finding ways to do it that other people might not think of. Um, and then the other thing I think is just that we know what it's like to be a patient. Um, I have other physical illnesses. I have ovarian failure. I have different, it's just like early menopause is the best way to explain it to your listeners. So when I went through that process alongside having burnout all at the same time, um, I learned what it was like to be gaslit. I learned what it was like not to be listened to. I learned what it was like to just be thrown medication at and not having anyone that wanted to know why. And as a neurodiverse person, why is so important to me. Why is like, if I don't get told why, good luck having me do it. I need a why. Um, so I learned what that was like firsthand, and that completely changed my nursing practice. And I actually went back to get further education in holistic nursing, and nurse coaching, because I realized that education was only such a small piece of what I needed as a human and what these other humans needed. They needed a chance to find their own answers and their own health as defined by them. So, and I think being neurodiverse and having that experience is radically going to better your patient's outcomes. I wish they do a study on it, like what
Mm.
the outcomes of neurodiverse nurses patients have, because I really think that they'd be more holistic naturally.
Yeah, I feel like when I was getting my holistic health coaching certification, they called it the thumbtack syndrome, and I thought about it a lot when it comes to advocacy, just in general, and in my own life, right? Like, so many medical providers are interested in solving the outcome without looking at the why. And so it's like the example they give with the thumbtack is that you have a thumbtack in your ass and you go to your doctor and you're like, my ass hurts, and the doctor's like, well, here's medicine for your pain, and they don't think to ask what's causing the pain. And so you have, but you so you know it's one thing to take the medicine, it's another thing to actually get to the root of like what is causing it. And so I think like we are such puzzle solvers by nature, right? So yeah, it is
Mm-hmm.
really important to take in to I think naturally we want to know the why, like there's a source for everything, and it's not enough to just be in pain management. And
Right.
I think, yeah, like you said, like so many of us as patients have experienced that kind of minimizing and dismissing of, a lot of our need for the why. And
Right.
there's this sort of a sense of like, well, why can't you just be happy enough with the pain management or whatever,
Right.
whatever the
Like,
pill is. Yeah.
right. Like, are you out of pain? Yeah, but are you out of pain?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
yeah,
right.
but there's
Yeah.
there's still the thumbtack in my ass, doc. Like, can we take that out? Like, I love that metaphor. Can I borrow that? Can I
Absolutely. I
use
mean, I
that?
have to
Thank you.
credit it with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, but yeah, I use it a lot. I use it all the time, and I think advocacy is so like it's something I think a lot of us struggle with and talk about, and it's certainly like an ongoing theme in my own life. And and then thinking about my children and like the accommodations that they need in school,
Oh yeah.
and advocating for themselves, and I think it's such a big topic, for all of us, but especially when
Oh,
you have spent most of your life sort of feeling dismissed or feeling like who you fundamentally are is wrong.
right.
And like what works for you is wrong, even though it works for you. Uh, and having to like relearn methods that work for other people, and then feeling like there's something wrong with us. All right, I'm on my soapbox now.
No, no, you're
I
fine.
mean,
No, I mean, no, I
it's
hear you. And it was
right.
when
Like
you said
it's all so connected.
accommodations, it is. And when you said accommodations, I actually just asked for accommodations and I had a relatively decent experience. And I just want to put it out there that if you are an adult and you want accommodations, it can be scary and it is opening a can of worms. But like for me, it's like I just wanted to do it because I wanted to be a nurse that asked for help. Like I just wanted to be one of those nurses that said, you know what, I need help.
Yeah.
Like this is getting too much. This could be easier for me now that I know I'm neurodivergent. Now I really realize that I need accommodations. Like, because I'm working in a world that wasn't made on the same wavelength or operating system. So it's like, can I have some accommodations, please, to deal with this? Um, and it's really interesting because I know there's a few nurses out there that's like, what can I get accommodations for? Like, it's nursing. You have to do what you have to do. Yeah, but it could be easier.
Yeah.
There's a way. And I'm
It,
glad
it
that your
is.
kids get accommodations too. That's wonderful.
Well, it's something we're certainly, a narrative we're constantly working on. But I think, like with nursing especially, I think it's one of those professions where it's like, it's considered a virtue to not need help, right? And so
Yes.
it's really it's a sign almost of weakness. It's a sign of inadequacy to need help in that profession. And so let's unpack that. Like okay, so when did you decide that you wanted to help other nurses? Because that was obviously before your
Yeah.
diagnosis, right?
Yeah, that was 3 years ago. I decided that even before that, but I started my coaching career officially like 3 years ago and founded Nourish the Nurturer because I felt so alone going through burnout. I felt ridiculously alone, and I didn't want other nurses to go through that alone. I was like, I had to fight and I had to learn, I had to advocate, and it was exhausting. Like I even said to my husband today that my healthcare is a job. Like I do it lovingly, but it is a job. Like
Mm.
it's so I wanted to help nurses and take an active role in their life and, be part of that job and maybe make it a little easier for them. Um, or not easier because it's hard. And that's like the one thing I always tell them is that this isn't a quick fix. This is something that you're going to learn and learn how to do without me
Yeah.
so you can keep doing it. Um, yeah, so I just decided to help nurses because that's why I didn't want to be by themselves. And I was like, I might as well, all this hyper focus and hyper fixation I did on burnout, I could use it. I could do something with this. So I did.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, not even just to say that. I think it's just the idea of like feeling seen is so important, right? And especially like in our own diagnosis journey, I think, why these conversations are so important is to feel like we're not alone, and to feel like what we are experiencing is to have that permission that, what we've been experiencing is other people have gone through it, and, we're not fundamentally broken.
Right. Right.
And so even just that validation, right? To provide that validation to nurses and be like, yeah, you should, it's normal to feel this way. It's normal to feel burnout. Look, to
Yes.
mirror that. Sometimes you get so wrapped up in like, I should be able to do this. What's wrong with me that I can't do
Right.
this? Sometimes you
Right.
need the permission from somebody outside of yourself to be like, nobody can do this or nobody should
Right.
do this. Right.
Right. Right. It's really the should. It's really the should,
Yeah.
because there's
Oh,
always going to
yeah.
be because there's always going to be a nurse that can for a
Well,
limited
that's,
amount
yeah.
of time, for a limited amount of time, not forever. And I think for nurses or people who are caregivers, even if they're caregiving for a family member, like this is what I do in a home nurse situation a lot, is I look years down the road. Like, yeah, you're doing it now. But if I came to you in 5 years and you were doing the same thing at the same amount of energy, where would your health be? Where would your brain be? Where would your spirit be? If you believe in having spirit, or just your emotional well-being, where would that be? And a lot of times I'm like, oh wow, probably not very good. I'm like, probably not. Like let's unpack this and see what we can do with this to make it so you're not just surviving, because that's how I felt and how I still feel sometimes as a nurse, is that I'm just surviving.
Mm. Mhm.
And since getting my diagnosis, my therapy has completely changed. Like I'm doing skill building now, EMDR, like my therapist now understands why I logically will understand, but why I sometimes won't enact what she tells me to do. I don't have anyone shaking their head at me, because I did talk to another psychiatrist about a year and a half before I was diagnosed about ADHD, and he's like, "Oh, well, I'll give you medicine." I was like, so I recoiled at that because I was like afraid. I was like, I just don't want to take something I haven't even been evaluated just because, I say I have it. So like that, yeah. And that's the thing with nurses too, is that there's just a lot of shame in being sick themselves
Yeah.
or needing support. So that's kind of my passion project right now is neurodiversity in nursing, yeah, there's different brains in nursing, there's different abilities in nursing, there's different disabilities in nursing, and we shouldn't hurt ourselves to hide them.
Mm. Mhm.
You can be disabled and be a nurse, you know um, and I really think that, especially with the pandemic and what it's done to nurses and what the administrations have done to nurses, I think it's about time that they gotta take us as we are, not have us at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of that conversation I had had with Katie Osoris about like it's so much easier to just applaud people for being incredible. Oh, you work so hard. We can't do what you do. Like, it's so much easier to create that narrative, especially for women and caretakers
Right.
of, oh, what you do is so amazing. Thank you so much, rather than actually providing a situation where they can have sustainable self-care.
Right.
Like just creating this idea of like, you're so amazing for being able to do all of these things, which then reinforces this idea that if you suddenly can't do all those things, then you become the problem. It makes it that much more difficult for you to
Right.
come and ask for help, because we've set up this system of your worth and your value is in holding up, like the Encanto song that's been moving everybody, right?
Hmm.
That idea
Yeah.
of like the
Yeah.
pressure, right? And that
Yes.
we create these situations of such intense pressure.
Yeah.
Um,
I yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's when is it gonna I just got the whole song in my head now.
I
I've
know,
been
right?
listening to
It's so moving,
Encanto,
right?
like, yeah, like nonstop for weeks. I don't even have kids, and I've been like, that's all I've been listening to.
I know.
That's my hyper
And
focus right now.
I love the
Love
fact that
it.
that song has struck a chord, and I love that
Yes.
character. Like I keep seeing posts
Oh
about how
yes.
like they thought the really pretty girl with the flowers was going to be all of the like Disney marketing, and they were going to have all little girls were only going to want that character. And there's been such this huge demand for this big, strong, muscular woman, and
Yeah.
they don't have enough like merchandise to meet up
Yeah.
with the demand. I'm like, yes. Uh,
I know. You know what's interesting though? The girl with the flower I also identify with.
Well, yeah. I mean, all
because
of
of
those
masking,
archetypes, right? Yeah.
right? Because of the
Yeah.
masking. She's like, especially her main song, Practice Perfect I'm like, hello, like that's what I did. Like
Yeah.
I like drama so much because I learned how to like I learned drama club because it was like, oh, go be this person this afternoon. Like that was so easy for me. They were like,
I know, right?
like
Yeah.
sorry, I was completely one off topic. I
Well,
don't want
I know. I'm like, I should have
but
you.
still I was
I'll have you
oh my
back for an entire episode on Encanto and like familial archetypes and masking. I know because it's like there is something really deep about that movie that has touched a chord with a lot of us. We're like, this isn't
God.
just a kids movie. This is like,
No, no.
and cross cultural too, right?
Yes,
Like it's. I think that's interesting about it too.
it's
All
really
right.
nice.
Well, there's a
Anyway,
PhD
well,
thesis
yeah,
somebody's writing right
well,
now.
yeah, we'll let that go for now.
So what does sustainable self-care look like for your clients? I mean, I because
Mhm.
it's funny because I've had coaching clients who are nurses, and I mean, it's really ingrained in your psyche to be everything and to wait until you are at your absolute wits end before you ask for help, right? And
Yeah,
so before you even begin to like think about the lifeline. So what does that look like when you start unpacking that with other nurses
we
or care
start.
professionals?
Yeah, we so nurses tend to know the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is like, your basics, food, shelter, safety, physical, and then you work your way up to more like, what people see as self-care is like spiritual growth. So we start the foundation. We start at like water, sleep. And they kind of look at me like, really? This is what I'm paying you to teach me is to sleep and to drink water. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm teaching you to acknowledge you have a body. And just like your patients require certain nutrition and hydration to survive, you do too. And it's really easy, especially for neurodiverse nurses, to get really caught up in their heads and what they're doing and taking care of people and forget that there's even discomfort in their body, not even feel it until they're done work, or not even feel it until they've done 3 or 4 shifts in a row. So self-care for nurses really looks at breaking it down super simply and having support, like constant support from me, because they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. At the beginning, like and that might sound pessimistic. How could I rephrase that? They want to do it. Everyone wants to take care of themselves. They feel like they can't because of what you said. It's ingrained in us not to ask for help.
Mhm. Yeah.
So we start at the foundation of that, and then we look at the emotions that it brings up. Then we look at emotional health. And that's kind of when we look at journaling, unpacking old behavior patterns, envisioning what we want our shifts to look like, envisioning what we would like work-life balance to be. So like creating an inspiration umbrella goal is huge. Like this big thing that you would like to cover your life is so important. And then from there, we do the foundation and we work our way up to touching that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I think self-care also for nurses, especially because we work so hard, is delegation at home. It's much
Mm,
easier at first to ask for help at home with people that know you're on this self-care journey and probably want an aspect of their partner or their family member or their friend back, because when nurses come to me, they're typically burned out.
mhm.
So when you burn out, you burn everything around you. You burn relationships, you burn your self-care, like everything's kind of ash. So you start asking for help from family members, like small things. Like when I get home, can I have 5 minutes in the car without talking to someone first? Or can you have a glass of water ready for me? Like I have them ask for very small things so they just get used to asking. And then, oh, the biggest self-care for a nurse is a 2-letter word: no.
Uh,
So they ask for help and then they have to start saying no,
yeah. Well, I
even if
think
they
it
don't want
goes
to.
right. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is like you start to, if when you start to experience burnout, you feel like you are a disappointment to other people in your life. And that is what leads to, it just starts to like spiral in on itself. And that's what leads to the depression and the burnout and that feeling of just like feeling like you're inadequate. And then I think so much of our depression and anxiety is wrapped up in that, right? Like I have
Hmm.
disappointed others.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the big thing too for nurses is they just think that they are disappointing everyone. So they hide it and they bury it. And it just causes them more pain and distress and unhealthy coping mechanisms that aren't sustainable, but ultimately hurting themselves is better than disappointing others. So that's the other thing with self-care is either, yeah, it's, and that's something I had to unlearn. And that's the piece that I tell nurses that you're going to default. You're going to go back to that. So it's self-care is about learning how to see it coming. So at least you can see it coming and learning to love that part of you and acknowledge it, but not give into it.
Yeah.
Because I almost did it this week. There's always a huge need for nurses here. There's not enough of us anywhere, let alone on an island in the middle of the ocean.
Mhm.
And I like found myself looking at my schedule. Where else can I put someone else? Can I put someone else? And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. No,
Yeah.
like this, yeah. So that's a big piece of self-care too, is knowing yourself.
Mhm. Wow. What an undertaking. I know there's so much there to unpack. I'm curious. Now, you had mentioned it earlier that you had worked with patients with autism, and so it's been
Hmm.
really profound for you to kind of have to rethink what it looks like, and
Yeah.
and how the face of it is changing. And I think that that's just on a bigger conversation too, of just like how the our understanding of neurodiversity is really changing the face of a lot of these diagnoses. So I'm curious, like,
Hmm.
what was your family's reaction to your diagnosis?
So some of them are going to find out before this airs.
Hey man,
Um,
I'm the first one to admit I do not talk about it with anybody in my family for lots of reasons. So no judgment there if you haven't even told anybody.
I have. Like my mom was kind of like, she was cool. Um, she pretty much was like, well, that's good, honey. Like, I think because I framed it in a way of, mom, my therapy is so different now. Like, I'm getting all this help and I'm doing like building of skills and like what's to do today. And like, because I could tell the first time I told her when we were in person a couple months ago, it didn't quite click. It didn't quite fully land because we had a lot going on. So I told her again, and then I told my one sister already, and she was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I gave her an example of how I used to kind of always stay in my bedroom and how it looked like I never wanted to be around everyone. And I was just a moody teenager when really I was completely overwhelmed because they were a lot louder than I was. So
Mhm.
sensory, it was just too much for me to handle. So I just kind of retreated. And so, and then my brother was like, "Oh, okay. Like, what does that mean?" Like, my brother's like, everyone was really like, again, huge blessings. I know a lot of people's families are just like, no, you're not.
Right?
Like,
We're just quirky. That's just who we are. Right?
right,
Yeah.
right. And I think I might have gotten that depending on how I also know my family, and from masking and from watching and observing so much, I know how to approach certain people, kind of like how your son was saying, like his teacher sees one part. Like I even had that going on in my family my whole life. So it's like I know how to approach them and how to make them understand.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where it is. And then ultimately, like I explained it to my husband really well when I was seeking diagnosis. I said, I don't care if they diagnose me as a purple Oompa Loompa. I just want the right treatment. And I think that made him understand that I wasn't like looking for anything specific. I just was looking for the right help. And I think that's
Right.
what I keep telling my family is all this is me getting the right help. I'll be 35 next month. And I'm just like, I feel like this is opening up a whole new section of my life. So um, just from getting the proper label or diagnoses.
That's so beautifully said. And it's I really related to that, that idea that like I just want the answer, like I just want to feel like I found the right answer.
Yeah.
And sometimes ADHD feels like the answer to so much that then I
Hmm.
start to question, like, am I just looking for an
Right.
answer? Have I just inserted this diagnosis into every one of life's mysteries? Because sometimes it feels like at the end of every question that acronym is the answer. Uh,
I know, yeah, and that's hard, especially like so. My biggest fear actually is one of my old patients' families hearing this interview
mm,
and saying, you know, feeling a certain way about me having the same diagnosis as their child.
mhm.
Um, that's my biggest, I don't want to say fear, but like, yeah, fear. We'll go with fear. I think that's the correct emotion I feel. So yeah, but it is what it is, and that is my diagnosis. I wasn't, not that, self-identification isn't valid, but I mean, for me as a nurse, it meant a lot to go actually check that box for this reason exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's I think the same way that we have to find that grace, or we have naturally have that grace for our parents who didn't know, we there's a lot of grief there when we sort of think about how our
Mhm.
lives could have been different if people had
Yeah,
known and saw the signs. But at the end of the day,
yeah,
really, like, people did the best they could.
yeah,
And so I think most people are understanding about that when it comes to, our learning curve. And and I think, by expanding what neurodiversity looks like, I think it only benefits, all
yes,
families really, to sort of to be able to kind of show the many, many faces to
yeah.
these what's happening. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't think I totally understand why you would feel that way. But I also feel like, I can at least mirror back and say, that I'm sure most families would have absolute grace for,
Yeah.
how you move forward, right? It's if you
Mhm.
continue to keep your head in the sand, that's the issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so really quick, would you
Yes.
rename ADHD to anything else?
Oh god, I thought about this so much, and I would love to rename it, um, only because it's so limiting. It is so limiting. Um, but I don't want it not to be a disorder.
Right? I know.
I
Yeah.
I want the word disorder in whatever the name is, because if it the big diagnostic criteria as it stands is that this impacts your life daily.
Mhm.
And I think that that is important because that's what allows accommodations to happen. So even though I don't view it just as that, and I do see the gifts within, um, I never want it to lose that punch. In my nurse brain is kind of like I always want it to be deficit or disability because I want people to get the support they need.
Right.
And because healthcare is often based a lot around financial decisions, if it was no longer classified as such, what would not be covered?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. No, I get it. I get it. I don't have an answer for that, so that's why I
yeah.
ask everybody else.
I I like to call my brain my spicy brain. Like sometimes I just say my brain's spicy, but that's just my cute little catchphrase
I
at
like
home.
it.
It's my spicy brain.
Okay, so now
Yeah.
Nourish the Nurturer. How can people find
Yes.
you and work with you? And what are some wonderful ways people can connect?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram under Nourish the Nurture, and I'm also launching a like subscription for Nourish Neurodiversity underneath of that umbrella. So people can work with me one on one, but we're also going to start nourishing our neurodiversity and our differences within the medical professional or just women in general. I do predominantly work with women, but for male nurses or any gender identity, anyone's welcome. I'm LGBTQ plus friendly. I'm pansexual myself, so like I'm with that crew. I'm with that alphabet mafia. So it's like so so yeah, so they can find me on Instagram, Facebook. I do not have TikTok because that is just dopamine on tap. So I am not on that platform. Um, but yeah, Instagram's the best way to find me, Nourish the Nurturer. And I'd love to connect with any listener that wants to learn how to better take care of themselves without the rules that they think they have to follow.
Mhm.
Self care has no rules.
And how to not wait until you are absolutely at your breaking point, I think is something that we all need to actively learn.
Yeah, that it's okay to have ask for help. It's okay to require help, and it's a judgment free space for anyone of any ability level. So I'd love,
Yeah.
and I have openings, so I'd love to hear from some people.
Oh, well, it's been such a joy hearing your story, and I love what you are doing for your fellow caretakers. I think it's such important work. And yeah, it's been really fascinating. I feel like I should go listen to Encanto again. uh,
Oh, that's where I'm going right after this.
so yeah, so
Thank
I was
you
so
so
great. I
much.
was so glad you reached out, and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for everything that you do. And thank you for this time together. I really appreciate you.